Hello. Make sure this works. Okay. Right. Thanks for the plug for labor, by the way. It's a very exciting time in the UK right now. And so if you have, in addition to you, if you're a UK citizen, obviously vote by proxy. And if you're not, if you have friends in the UK, please get in touch with them and persuade them to get all of their friends as well to go and vote for Labour. It's really like a once in a lifetime, for me, opportunity to get a progressive government in Europe. So it's wonderful to be here, and thank you for the invitation. It's good to see a good turnout. I'm looking forward to engaging with you all on this. What I'm going to do is give you a kind of introduction from a climate perspective to some of the key principles of post-growth economics and degrowth, okay? And I'm sure you'll have many more in-depth questions that we can explore after this presentation. Let's see how we go. I want to start with this image. How many of you all have seen this before? The image of the planetary boundaries framework. To me, this is one of the most important innovations in environmental science and ecological science in the past couple of decades. And what it does basically, it gives us a sense for where we're at on a number of key Earth systems boundaries. So we have everything from climate change in the middle here at the top. Anything in yellow is where we're overshooting the planetary boundary. So the planetary boundary for climate change is 350 parts per million atmospheric concentration of CO2. We've overshot that significantly. There's also genetic diversity, that's species extinction rates. Land system change includes conversion to agriculture as well as deforestation. Phosphorus and nitrogen loading here from intensive industrial farming, ocean acidification, et cetera. And so what's interesting about this is that it gives us a new way to think about limits. The old way in the 1970s was that if we continue on with capitalist growth, we're going to run out of resources and GDP is going to start falling, okay? This is actually the wrong way to think about it. It's ecologically inaccurate. The planetary boundaries framework helps us understand that the real consequence here is that we begin to degrade the web of life. We degrade living systems, we degrade the stability of key Earth system processes. And that's what becomes a threat, not to GDP growth, but to living systems, including human civilization, okay? So this is a more accurate, more robust, more ecologically informed way of thinking about limits, right? Now, the crucial thing to understand, of course, is that we're not only facing a climate crisis, as the planetary boundaries framework illustrates. We have a number of dimensions that we need to be thinking about. Deforestation is one key one. This is a serious crisis right now. Since 1950, we've lost about half of our mature tropical forests. At our present rate of deforestation, we'll lose the other half by the year 2050, okay? It could be that our children, if you choose to have them, will not know what a mature tropical forest looks like, right? Soil depletion is another major crisis. Right now, about 40% of the world's agricultural soils are overexploited due to intensive industrial farming, okay? Extraction from the soil. UN scientists say that we have about 60 years of harvests left in the soil, right? This is something that should keep us up at night as much as the climate crisis. Ocean dead zones as a consequence of phosphorus and nitrogen loading in the soils, ends up in the oceans, creates huge dead zones in the coastal regions around major industrial countries. Fish stocks are collapsing. 85% of fish stocks around the world are in depletion. For the first time in history, we're reaching a point where fish catches are beginning to decline, despite the fact that we have ever more intensive extractive methods for fishing. Insects die off. This is a big problem here in Germany, but also in France and the UK and elsewhere in the world, with 75% of insect biomass being lost over the past 25 years alone. Again, if you speak to ecologists, they'll tell you that while climate change for them is a major issue, what really worries them is species extinction, with insects being a key dimension of that. But more broadly, we're in a situation where the background rate of extinction is about 1,000 times faster than before the Industrial Revolution, with scientists saying that we're in the 6th mass extinction, with the last one having happened about 66 million years ago. Okay, and then of course there's climate change, which is what we're going to talk about today. Now what's important to recognize here is that this is not just a matter of changing temperatures. It has a number of knock-on effects that are important to keep in mind, right? So to me, the most worrying dimensions of this include things like, well, its contributions to species extinction rates, but also food supply decline. Okay, so for every degree that we heat the planet, and we're on course for about 4 degrees right now, we'll lose about 10% of agricultural yields. Agricultural yields will decline by 10%. So this, of course, will trigger a political crisis with migrants leaving uninhabitable areas from more habitable parts of the planet. Already you can see Europe is falling apart as a consequence of this kind of political pressure. Okay. Now, if we were to put all of this into one unit, okay, then it would probably be what ecologists call the global material footprints. Material footprints counts everything that humans extract and produce and consume every year, right? So everything from fish to forests, everything from minerals to metals, everything from plastics to petroleums, and adds it up in tons. And what we see here is that material footprint in tons has been accelerating dramatically over the past few decades, breaching what ecologists say is the safe planetary boundary in about 1997. That's 50 billion tons. We're now in the region of hitting over 80 or 90 billion tons, and on our present trajectory, we'll hit in the region of 180 billion tons per year by the middle of the century. Okay, that's sort of business as usual projections. It's important to understand that this is being driven by GDP growth. There's a very tight relationship between GDP and material footprints. Okay. As you can see here, since 1990, GDP, which is the gray line, has actually risen at a faster rate than material footprint has been rising. So instead of a dematerialization of our economy, which is what everyone assumed was going to happen, into the 21st century, we've seen actually a rematerialization, a recoupling of GDP from resource use to resource use. Now, and this is interesting because right, we were told that as we switch increasingly to a service-based economy, then we're going to have rising GDP but a declining rate of material throughput. But in fact, the opposite has been happening. And that's really curious. And it really, it sort of pops the bubble of economists who insist that everything's going to be fine as we switch to services. In fact, the countries with the highest proportion of services as part of their GDP are also the countries that have the highest material footprints in per capita terms. Is the translation having trouble? Okay, I will. And what's important to realize is that virtually all of this overshoot, okay, is being driven by a handful of rich countries. And we can see it this way. If we divide up countries by income group, what we see is that, so here we have the blue is 1990, the orange is the year 2008, the red line there is the planetary boundary in per capita terms, which is about 7 tons per capita is the safe level of material footprint consumption. High-income nations consume in the region of 28 material tons of stuff per person per year, about 4 times over the safe planetary boundary, right? In low-income nations, it's in the region of 2. In lower middle-income nations, in the region of 3 or 4. So what becomes clear is that if everyone in the world consumed at the rate of the average person in the rest of the world outside of high-income nations, we would not be in a condition of material footprint overshoot, okay? And material footprint is an important indicator because it's what's driving virtually all of the key ecological crises that we spoke about earlier, okay? If we were to all consume at the same level as the average person in the average high-income nation, we would need approximately 4 planets to sustain that kind of consumption, right? So this is, and this of course flips our existing understanding of how development should work, okay? I mean, if the objective is that everyone becomes high-income nations, this is clearly an ecologically insane objective. But the key focus here, right, is climate breakdown. And what I want to show you here is the black line here is our historical trajectory of CO2 emissions per year, CO2 equivalents per year. The orange line is a reference scenario. If we carry on with business as usual, scientists say we're going to hit over 4 degrees of global heating by the end of the century. Okay, this we have to be clear is, according to scientists, not compatible with the continuation of organized global civilization as we know it. This is a catastrophe scenario. Now, the blue line is the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is based on, is voluntary, remember, and is based on the voluntary contributions of all signatory nations. If you add up those contributions, then what you see is that we're on a trajectory to not decrease emissions at all, but rather to continue increasing them under the Paris Agreement, which is supposed to keep us down to 1.5 or 2 degrees, to the point where by the end of the century, we will hit 3.3 degrees of warming, which again, scientists are clear, is not compatible with organized global civilization. Okay. Why is this happening? We all thought the Paris Agreement was sort of our savior, right? The reason Well, there's a couple of reasons. Two I'll mention. The key reason is because growth is outstripping the gains that we're making in terms of energy efficiency and emissions reductions, right? So you can roll out some renewable energy, but as long as you keep growing the economy, it's outstripping the gains you're making by transitioning to renewables, right? So that's one reason. The other reason is because of a thing called BECCS. Is everyone here familiar with what BECCS is? Let's see a show of hands. Just a couple of people. It's very important to know about this because this is actually at the very center of most nations' plans in terms of emissions mitigation, right? It stands for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECCS. And the idea here is that you'll grow massive tree plantations around the world. The trees will suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Then you'll cut down the plantations, turn the trees into wood pellets, ship them around the world, and burn them in power stations. You'll capture the emissions from those power stations with a special technology that barely exists right now. You'll turn it into a solid or a liquid, and you'll store it deep under the ground, okay? So what this effectively is a way of, it's a net negative emissions technology that allows you to have an energy source that actually sucks carbon out of the atmosphere, right? So many nations are relying on the idea that sometime in the middle of the century, we'll be able to develop this technology, which again doesn't exist at scale today, scale it up to the point where we can suck emissions out of the atmosphere and we're going to be fine. So we can keep emitting on this rising trajectory while still bringing us down eventually to 1.5 or 2 degrees. The problem is that now scientists are coming out against this idea in mass, okay? Pointing out that it has a number of really fatal flaws. First of all, the technology doesn't properly exist. And so continuing to emit at this rate with technology that may not come down the pipeline is basically locking you into a high-risk strategy where you're locked into a high-temperature pathway, okay? So there's an immense moral hazard here. You can't escape this scenario if the technology doesn't work. The second thing is it would demand so much land. It would be equivalent to about 2 to 3 times the size of the land mass of India, right? Which would have to be under intensive monoculture. So this is going to compete with food crops significantly. The monoculture is going to drive further biodiversity collapse and species loss and so on. And so maybe the strategy will work if the tech does emerge, but only by impinging significantly on social indicators, on social objectives, and on other ecological objectives, right? So it ends up not making much sense at all. And the IPCC, which has relied on assumptions related to BECCS for a long time, has finally listened to scientists' critiques of this plan and has now been publishing for the first time models that do not rely on the assumption of future net negative emissions technologies. And what they show is that in the absence of those technologies, then this is the trajectory we have to achieve, right? Have you all seen this picture? This was published in the IPCC report that came out last year on 1.5 degrees. You know, the idea being we have to cut emissions in half by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050, okay? Now, that objective has actually been brutally misinterpreted because in fact, that's a global trajectory, but rich nations, which have contributed the vast majority of emissions historically, have to achieve a much more rapid transition, okay? Rich nations need to hit net zero by between 2025 and 2030 in order to be consistent with the principle of equity, which is enshrined in the Paris Agreement, okay? Giving poorer nations a little bit more time to make that transition for the sake of development, okay? And so if your politicians are saying, no, don't worry, we're in line with the 1.5 degree target, we're going to reduce emissions to zero by 2050, then you have to inform them that they're woefully misguided. In fact, it needs to be much earlier than that. So the Extinction Rebellion movement in the UK, you know, they've been calling for net zero by 2025. This sounds extremely radical and unfeasible, but in fact, it's exactly in line with what scientists say is necessary given the principle of equity in the Paris Agreement. I can't emphasize enough what this figure represents. It represents a dramatic reversal of our present direction as a civilization, okay? We've built up a fossil fuel infrastructure-based economy for the past 200 years, and we have to completely transform it in the matter of 30 years or less. Right? This is a dramatic shift. So the question becomes this: can we do this, right? Now, theoretically, the answer is yes, and this is the good news. And I'm sure you all know basically what needs to be done in this respect. We need a rapid rollout of renewable energy with a focus probably on solar and wind technology to eliminate emissions from fossil fuels. We need significant reforestation, soil regeneration for carbon sequestration in the soils, and a shift to bee-free diets to end net emissions from land use, okay? This also has to be part of our conversation besides just a transition away from fossil fuels. And we need to switch to next generation industrial processes to cut emissions from things like cement, steel, and plastic production, right? I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the production of these materials actually produces emissions completely regardless of the energy source that they use for the process, okay? This is achievable, we know, with massive public investments, with state subsidies for renewable energy, and also the removal of subsidies for fossil fuels, caps on fossil fuels, things like that, carbon taxes, and guided finance, which are effectively the principles of what we're calling a Green New Deal. So we know that it's possible, we know that it's feasible. The question becomes, this is the question, can we do this while at the same time continuing to grow the global economy at existing rates? And this is where things begin to get a bit sticky, right? So right now we're growing the economy at about 3% per year globally. And this is effectively the target that most nations aim for, roughly. That doesn't sound like very much. It's a small increment, but yeah, we have to remember that growth is an exponential function. And so it's compounding. And so what happens here is that this is effectively basically tripling the size of the global economy, of global economic activity by the middle of the century, okay? 2.5, it's about a factor of 2.5 times, roughly. So the question becomes then, can we decarbonize the entire global economy while at the same time tripling its size, or nearly tripling its size? And this is where we get into the mud of the math, basically. But instead of taking you there, which is intensive, I'll just leave you with the conclusion from the science, and that is that all of the empirical data that we have right now says that the answer is no. Even in the most optimistic possible scenarios, it's not feasible for us to transition quickly enough to stay within 1.5 degrees, and certainly not in rich nations, while at the same time continuing growth at existing rates. Okay, does this make sense to you all? In the sense of the more we grow the economy, the more energy we use. The more energy we use, the more difficult it is to supply that energy with renewables. Okay, so it's kind of like we're fighting an uphill battle needlessly, or fighting with one hand tied behind our back. So the IPCC report deals with this problem. And what they point out is this. Oh no, the wrong order. They point out this, that in order to make it feasible for us to stay under 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees without net negative emissions technologies, okay, then we have to scale down total energy demands in high income nations to make it feasible to accomplish a rapid transition to renewables, right? And the question is, how do we do that, right? This is not a matter of just taking shorter showers, right, or switching to LED light bulbs, or turning off the light when you leave a room, et cetera. I mean, obviously these are important measures, but ultimately household energy consumption is an extremely small part of the economy's total energy consumption. The vast majority of energy consumption actually comes from industrial processes, okay? So it takes an extraordinary amount of energy to extract and produce and consume and transport all of the materials that our economy chews through every year. And that's really where the energy demand is coming from. And so according to the IPCC, they've proposed a degrowth model, right, which requires scaling down in high income nations material extraction, production, and consumption. Okay, and this is effectively what we would call a degrowth model. Now, I just want to show you briefly this this graph here. What we have on the bottom axis here is human development. Okay, and what we have here is material footprint per capita in tons. And so what we see is that it's not all nations that need to accomplish this kind of material degrowth. Okay, it's only nations that are significantly above this sustainable threshold here. So here's the UK. And Germany is actually right next to it. And so what we see is in countries like Germany and the UK, they need to reduce their material throughput probably by in the region of 2/3, okay, which is pretty significant. So does this make sense to you? We have to scale down material throughput in order to scale down energy use, in order to make it feasible to accomplish a rapid transition to renewables, okay? That's the equation here. So the good news is this: we can reduce material production and consumption while at the same time improving human well-being and social indicators. This is important because every time you get into a kind of degrowth conversation, immediately people are going to tell you that sounds like voluntary impoverishments. You know, if Germany was to consume 60% less material stuff per year, then we'd basically be in a condition of austerity, right? Nobody wants to live like that. In fact, the data shows exactly the opposite. And that's what I want to show you here. But first, a couple of interesting points. Take the US, right? In the US, in 1975, GDP per capita was 50% lower than it is today. And yet, despite that fact, they had higher happiness levels, they had higher wages, and they had a lower poverty rate. How is that possible? That their economy on a per capita basis could be half the size that it is today, and yet they're doing better in terms of social indicators. It's effectively because they invested more in social spending, income was distributed more equitably. And so you're able to achieve high levels of social indicators despite significantly lower income. This is true in Europe as well if you compare Europe to the US. Europe's GDP per capita is 40% lower than America's, and yet they have better social indicators across the board, right? Better education, better healthcare, better longevity, better coffee, better football, better cathedrals, right? Take Costa Rica, for example. Costa Rica's GDP per capita is 1/5 that of the US. 1/5, right? And yet they have higher happiness levels that rival Denmark. They have a higher life expectancy than the US, et cetera. In lots of ways, they outperform the US on social indicators. How is that possible? Because Costa Rica has a robust universal healthcare and education system and a strong pension system as well, right? These are the kinds of things that matter when it comes to improving social welfare. So the question is, how do we make this kind of dramatic shift towards a reduction in material throughput happen, right, in a country like Germany or the UK? Now, crucially, this is not just about changing personal behavior. Okay, this is fundamentally about designing a new economic system that does not require endless growth in the first place. Okay, now it's tempting to think that all we need to do is not ask our parents for iPhones and trips to Crete, right? But in fact, that's not the way that we're going to solve this problem, right? This is not about individual choices about consumption. I mean, of course that matters. Of course you should, consume less and recycle and compost and so on. But ultimately, right, we can't change the system by simply operating as individuals. So if you think about, if you take the US in the 1940s, right, extremely racist country, Jim Crow laws, deeply segregated, a racist system. If you were a white person in the US in the 1940s, it would not be enough for you to just say, I'm going to go sit at home in my apartment alone and try my best to not be racist, right? That's not going to solve the problem. You have to obviously get out and organize and fundamentally transform a racist system. And that's the same thing that has to happen when it comes to the way our economy works. So the question then becomes this, okay? How do we liberate ourselves from the growth imperatives that are embedded in the existing economy? To think of how to do that, we first have to understand what those growth imperatives are. And I'm sure that there are a few that you can imagine. But here are some of the ones that come to mind for me. Because politicians see GDP as an indicator of progress, and so they're incentivized to pursue it. Politicians on the left and right alike rise and fall on their ability, on their promises to produce more growth, right? I mean, literally everyone talks about this. There's a kind of ideological hegemony around growthism. If you're a politician that says you're going to keep GDP at existing levels or even reduce GDP, then you will literally be laughed off the stage. Okay, so this is a problem. As long as we're measuring the economy in terms of GDP, then there's going to be incentives to pursue growth. Because corporations have a fiduciary duty to shareholders. I mean, this is a crucial piece of the growth imperative. I don't know if you remember the American Airlines crisis that happened, I think last year or the year before. They had not given a raise to their employees for 20 years or something like that. And they had surpluses and they thought, look, let's be nice. Let's give our employees a raise. But they were immediately punished by shareholders who claimed, no, that your revenues are actually belong to us. It's our capital. And so they had to backtrack from their promise to give their employees a raise, right? Shareholders have an incredible amount of power to demand that that companies pursue growth and profits at all cost. Here's another big claim, right? That we need growth because we need to reduce poverty and improve lives. Okay, this is again something that you'll hear our politicians saying all the time. Because we have to pay debts. Debt, of course, comes with interest. Interest is a compound function. It rises exponentially, and so if you want to be able to pay down your debts and avoid a financial crisis and austerity and so on, then you have to grow the economy in order to be able to do that. And that's true of households, it's true of businesses, it's true of states. Okay, so debt is a key driver of the growth imperative. And because people need jobs in a capitalist society, this becomes an imperative, right? So capitalism is organized in a way that is constantly producing labor productivity gains. But as labor productivity increases, then the need for labor in the economy decreases, right? And so you get a constant production of unemployment under capitalism. And the only way to deal with that problem is to grow the economy to create new jobs, okay? And this is what, again, our political system is locked into this trap of having to always grow to create new jobs to absorb unemployment created by productivity increases, right? This is particularly true as automation becomes more of a force. Because advertising compels people to consume. There are strong psychological drivers for the growth imperative. We're bombarded by hundreds, if not thousands, of ads every day, convincing us to be dissatisfied with our lives and to buy things to sort of to satisfy that need. And of course, because capital requires it, right? If capital is in an industry that is not growing, it will immediately pull out of the industry and pile somewhere else that's growing. And so, there's kind of this imperative in capital itself to sort of desperately writhe around until it can stick its tentacles into something that's growing, okay? It's an effective imperative in a capitalist society. So how can we effectively sort of euthanize these growth imperatives in the economy? This is the kind of systems level we have to be thinking on, I think. So I want to run through what I would propose as kind of a concrete post-growth policy platform, okay? The first step, I think, is to get rid of GDP and change the way that we measure progress, right? GDP, when it was first invented in the 1930s by Simon Kuznets and proposed to the US Congress, then he stood there and he said, whatever you do, make sure that you never use this measure as a normal measure of economic success or progress. And yet that's exactly what we do today. The reason he warned against it is because GDP has a strange accounting mechanism. It counts everything that we sort of churn into money in the economy every year, but it has no cost accounting of the consequences of that, right? So if you cut down a forest and sell the forest for timber to IKEA, then GDP goes up, but it doesn't say anything about the loss of that forest as a home for biodiversity or as a sink for carbon. Okay, none of that is accounted for in GDP. But there are alternatives that we could use, right, like the genuine progress indicator, or GPI. Has anyone heard of this before? A few people? It basically starts with GDP and then subtracts social and ecological negatives from that, okay? And so you get a clear picture of the real progress, right, of a society, of an economy. And what we see here on a global level is that while GDP has been rising steadily over the past many decades, GPI actually reached a plateau at about 1970 and has been actually declining slowly since then. And this decline is more pronounced in rich nations, okay? So when we start accounting for the costs of GDP growth, then our picture of progress changes significantly. So if you were to establish GPI as a measure for politicians to pursue in a country like Germany, it would change the way that incentives work in the economy. They would be incentivized to reduce ecological and social bads while at the same time maximizing ecological and social goods, okay? We need to change shareholder value rules. In many countries, this can be done very easily with just with small changes to a few lines of law to make sure that companies have the freedom to do things other than just maximize profits every year, okay? I've spoken to a number of CEOs who actually, surprisingly, are really interested in this idea because not all CEOs are horrible people, actually. It's interesting. Many of them actually want to do good things in their companies, and yet they're prevented from doing so because of the pressure that comes from shareholder value rules. So that can be changed. Now what's interesting is these two proposals are the ones you'll hear most often in kind of the post-growth space. We just need these two simple fixes, change what we measure, change some of the laws around this, and we'll be fine. Now, my argument is that these are in fact not enough by a long shot. And anyone who goes only this far and no further, I think is really missing the points about what's necessary to achieve a post-growth economy. For me, the most important thing to focus on here is an active plan with legislation to scale down unnecessary material throughput. Right? So what does that look like? One thing might be a ban on the practice of planned obsolescence, by which companies produce goods that are designed to break down quickly so as to maximize turnover, right? And this is true from everything for this computer to our iPhones, which we have to, or any smartphone, which has to be replaced every 2 or 3 years. This is not an intrinsic feature, right, of the production process. Okay, it's something that's been introduced purposefully to maximize turnover. It's easy enough to ban that practice, and you can do it with things like legislation for extended product warranties. And so Apple would be forced, for example, to make sure that this computer lasts for 15 years instead of 5 years. And if it doesn't last that long, they have to repair it. Okay, they're under obligation to repair it. You can introduce a right to repair as well to make sure that, it's impossible for me to fix this computer because there's not even screws on it. I can't even take it apart, right? And that's intentional, of course. But you can mandate that products be produced in a way that everyday consumers can repair them easily or get someone on the street corner to do so, right? They should all be repairable. This is an idea that's taking root around Europe these days. We can put an end to food waste. 50% of the food that our economy chews through every year in high-income nations gets wasted at the supermarket level, at the farm level, and the household level. That can be ended pretty easily. Countries like France and Italy are already finding ways to do that at the supermarket level. South Korea has found a way to virtually eliminate household food waste. Right? There's no reason that countries like Germany and the UK can't do the same. Okay. We can shift from patterns of ownership to models of usership, right? Especially with things like cars, right? There's no reason that each family has to own their own car when we can very easily share them with app-based sharing platforms not owned by Uber, but publicly owned and managed, right? And we can have a democratic conversation about actively scaling down destructive and socially less necessary industries, right? Let's talk about, do we want to actively degrow the SUV industry? Not socially necessary, right? A huge contributor to material and energy throughput. We could have a conversation about how much we want that energy to grow or degrow, right? A real democratic economy would let us have a conversation like that. And yet right now the assumption is that all industries have to grow, which is obviously absurd. Another way to approach this is to introduce legislation that caps annual resource use every year and then tightens that cap year on year until it's down to sustainable levels or to levels that are compatible with the energy transition we need to achieve, okay? So you can take your approach to this, but what's interesting is that measures like banning planned obsolescence and using extended warranties on products, these might seem like small interventions, but in fact they're very powerful, right? I mean, think about it. If our washing machines and computers and everything else last 3 times longer than they presently do, that means we consume 1/3 as many. And that's not just 1/3 as many of those actual products, but that's 1/3 as much, warehouse space, transportation miles, extraction and all the equipment necessary for extraction, et cetera, it has a huge ramification effects through the economy in terms of material and energy use. Okay, and what's important about this is that this is not a model for austerity or misery, right? The vast majority of people would either not notice this is happening, okay, because they still have access to the goods they need, or they would be actively happy about it because they're spending less time running around trying to replace the goods that are constantly breaking. Okay, nobody wants to do that. It's expensive and horrible. So this is a model for dramatic reductions in material throughput that would not entail any negative consequences for human well-being, right? But you should be asking a question. If we are producing and consuming 1/3 as much stuff, then what does that mean for employment? Okay, if we're literally scaling down unnecessary economic activity, what's going to happen to jobs? How do you deal with that problem? And this is why absolutely essential to this policy package is this proposal. Oh, sorry, this is another thing I was going to say. I'll just briefly mention. This may sound crazy and fascist, but it is in fact It's in fact not, right? The city of Sao Paulo has banned ads from public spaces. That's a city of 18 million people. What's the consequence? People are happier. There's less anxiety. People are more content with their lives, right? If you're not being bombarded constantly by advertisements, then your mind has space to work. You can think, you can be creative. Your mind is not being colonized at every opportunity by someone telling you what to do, right? People actually really like this intervention. And it's a completely feasible one to achieve. If a major city in a third world country can accomplish this, there's no reason that we can't do that in a country like Germany or the UK. Anyways, back to my point. Absolutely crucial to this policy agenda needs to be shortening the working week, right? If you shorten the working week, then you can redistribute necessary labor in the economy to maintain full employment, okay? So you can scale down unnecessary economic activity while maintaining full employment at the same time. Of course, you have to increase hourly wages with a strong living wage policy to make sure that there's no loss of income for ordinary workers, okay? But that's easy enough to do. These policies, while they seem radical, okay, have been proposed for a very long time. I mean, Keynes, back in the 1930s, was clear that there's no reason we can't translate massive productivity gains into an extremely short working week so that we can all devote ourselves not to meaningless labor, producing products that are designed to break down, right, but rather to the arts of living. And it's time now, nearly a century later, for us to claim that very practical vision from a man who is not at all a crazy radical, but if anything, a kind of sensible centrist, okay? This is something that we can do. Another option is that to offset any consequences for small businesses, you could introduce a universal basic income to offset wage losses, okay? Another key thing here is this, okay? So politicians will tell you that we need to grow in order to improve people's lives, right? And the reason they say that is because for them, explicitly, growth is preferable, as a preferable substitute for redistribution or for fair distribution, okay? But if that's true, then we can reverse that equation and use it against them, right? Equality or redistribution can be a substitute for the growth imperative, right? In fact, the way I see it is that equality is the antidote to the growth imperative. We can achieve our social goals right now without any growth at all, simply by sharing what we already have more fairly, right? We already live in extremely wealthy economies, okay? It's ludicrous to imagine that in order to solve our social problems in countries like the UK and Germany, we need to continue growing indefinitely, okay? We're already extremely wealthy economies. We can solve those goals, we can solve those problems now with a fair distribution of existing income. And at the same time, this is crucial, invest in robust public services and affordable housing, okay? And I'm talking about beyond just education and healthcare. We need to think about transportation as a free public service, okay? Internet as a free public service. This is what the Labour Party is doing in the UK. Things like that, okay? And the idea behind this is that the more that we can access in terms of commons, the less we need in terms of private income in order to lead good lives, right? So if you think about London, for example, rents in London are absolutely insane. If you want a one-bedroom apartment, you'll pay 1.5 or 2,000 pounds a month, okay? These prices are completely fictional as a consequence of speculation on the housing markets from the City of London. There's no reason that we couldn't cap rents at half that level. And if you're able to do that, then suddenly Londoners could work and earn and produce significantly less stuff without suffering any negative consequences of their quality of life, right? They can still access the goods that they need. Their purchasing power of their income improves significantly, so they can scale down unnecessary production without any consequences, right? This is crucial, I think. We talked about how debt is a key imperative of growth. And so the answer to that one is debt jubilees. And this, again, might seem crazy, but it's done frequently. And there's no reason that we can't make plans collectively to cancel unpayable and odious debts. And that can happen at the state level, that can happen within companies, that can happen within households. Okay, we can have household debt write-offs, we can have student debt write-offs, and so on. There's citizens' assemblies that are happening across Southern Europe, Southern European towns, that are looking at debts that their cities have and deciding which ones need to be repaid and which ones can be legitimately canceled, okay? Again, this is what a real democratic economy would do. Think about what debts actually have to be repaid. this would also require actually shifting to a debt-free currency. I'm not going to spend any time on this, but one of the problems with our existing system is that the fractional reserve banking system means that every dollar or euro or pound that circulates in our economy is effectively debt. It carries debt with it, right? Because it's created as credit by banks when they make loans. And so one way to think about reducing the amount of debt in our economy is to switch to a debt-free currency. And there's significant proposals for doing that have been around since, again, the 1930s with the Chicago Plan. The IMF themselves in 2012 proposed what they called the Chicago Plan Revisited, a proposal for a debt-free currency in the US and the EU. Okay. Now, the benefit of this approach, right, what I'm proposing here is not just that it enables us to accomplish a rapid transition to renewables, but also that it has positive benefits for all of the other dimensions of planetary boundary overshoot, okay? So, and this is crucial because too often we think about the climate problem in isolation from these other crucial ecological crises. But by thinking about the climate problem in terms of energy and material throughput, reducing those things, it becomes ecologically coherent in addition to technologically feasible, right? We know that it's possible to accomplish this, and this is where I'm going to end. We now have robust research and models on what a post-growth economy could look like and how it would work. We have these models tailored specifically to countries like Canada and France. We can do them for any country virtually, showing that, that material throughput can decline, energy use can decline, while at the same time employment remains high, and well-being remains high, and poverty goes down. Okay, we can demonstrate how this works. There's also a growing scholarly consensus, not just that this is possible, but also desirable. I'm not sure if you saw, but last year, 300 scientists from across Europe wrote a letter to the European Commission calling on them to shift towards post-growth principles in their, not just environments, but also in economic planning. Okay. In fact, just November, there was another letter signed by 11,000 scientists that included post-growth and degrowth objectives at the very core of their plan for rapid energy transition. Okay. 11,000 scientists, that's a lot. I mean, that's effectively, like it's hard to get more scientific consensus than that, okay? This is very strong. And better yet, the important thing to emphasize here is that people actually want a post-growth economy. And this is really where people always want to raise questions, right? In a democracy, okay, so maybe this is feasible in some kind of totalitarian state, but what about in a democracy? People are never going to vote for less, okay? But in fact, the opinion polls we have show that exactly the opposite is true. We see that over and over again, large majorities of people across Europe and other parts of the industrialized world actually say that they want ecological stability and well-being, human well-being, to be prioritized over GDP growth, right? Clearly there's a shift happening in public consciousness where people are increasingly recognizing the problems with the growthist model, and they're desperate for something else, right? Now, I guess in conclusion, the thing to say here is that we shouldn't ignore the facts that what I proposed here is effectively incompatible with capitalism as we know it. Okay, but I don't think this is something that we should be afraid of. And if you think about it, we live in a culture that's completely enamored of innovation. Okay, I mean, we would never see a laptop or a smartphone or a painting and say that's the best smartphone or painting that's ever been produced, and we will never improve on it. Right? Obviously, we believe that we will almost instantaneously improve on it next year, and there's an imperative to do so almost in our culture. So why is it that when it comes to the most important thing in our world, the economy, we've all been convinced that this is the way that it must be, and it can never change, right? We're sort of stuck with this dusty old dogmatic 19th century model of economics. And what we need to do is get our best minds focused on imagining a fundamentally different economy that is just and fair and compatible with the ecological realities of the 21st century. I'm convinced that such an economy can be a happier one, a more intimate one, a more exciting one, and ultimately a more rewarding one. And this is exactly what we should be pursuing. So thank you. I'm happy to take some questions, which I guess I'll field myself.
I have a mic. Who wants to start? You first.
Thanks a lot, and thanks, Jason. My name is Tom. I'm from the Czech Republic. I'm a think tanker, a lobbyist. I'm very much with you on this page. So thanks a lot for the input and the enthusiasm you put into this. I have a question, though. I think there are a bunch of trade-offs in this whole model that may have not been fully addressed by your speech. You speak about increasing hourly wages at the same time while cutting down on economic. How do we actually do that? Where do we get the resources? How do we get the taxes necessary? And for the politicians, do you really think that it's so simple to say that there is a prevailing or a growing society consensus on this being the political priority number one? I think maybe in your national context that might be becoming the case, but in, say, only Central Eastern Europe, the perspective might have been already quite different. So I think you need to address a lot of very difficult decisions and also be able to speak to the politicians in these terms, because they are very much pulled apart by the voter opinions and voter needs. So I think we need to be quite succinct in addressing all of those trade-offs that are out there.
Yeah, I agree. The question about, I'll just address the question about wages. Look, I mean, the disparity between CEO and management salaries and average worker wages and salaries is extraordinary, okay, within companies, and has been growing dramatically over the past 40 years, right? So reversing that trajectory is what I'm calling for effectively, right? So in companies, there's significant room to redistribute income within companies downwards towards wages. And this is why I'm always saying, like, look, a redistribution of income within companies or within the economy is the key here. Okay, there's absolutely no question you can achieve a zero growth economy right now, and at the same time raise wages. Okay, or even achieve some reduction of economic activity. Okay, while at the same time raising wages. This should not be a problem. Now, if you start reducing economic activity really significantly, then you start running into trouble, because the give you have, right, in inequality becomes less fruitful, effectively. And so that's when you start needing other tools. And this is where something like investment in commons really becomes essential, right? And again, the principle here is that the more people have access to the commons they need to live well, then the less private income they need to achieve a good life, okay? So, and what this is effectively improving the purchasing power of existing incomes. And this is why I say both are necessary. On some level, we can increase wages with redistribution, but past a certain level, that's no longer possible. And at that point, what you need is an expansion of the commons, right, to improve the purchasing power of incomes. Does this make sense to you, right? If I was able to pay half as much for my house, then I could work probably 25% less and earn 25% less without even noticing any loss in my quality of life. In fact, it would improve, wouldn't it, right? Because I would have more leisure time. So this is the kind of thing I'm calling for. As far as the political realities in different countries, yes, I acknowledge that. But still, I think these opinion polls are very interesting, because we see that even in deep South states in the US, according to a Yale poll that came out last year, deep red states in the US, right, Republican voting, 70% of respondents will say that they prefer ecological stability and well-being over GDP growth. That's extraordinary, right? And this is before they know about all the good things that a post-growth economy will actually entail. This is while they still think that it's going to be miserable, right? I mean, I don't actually know. But this is the kind of thing that focus groups could investigate. But yes, but no one's saying be naive about it, right? But I think the key first step for politicians in any context is not to talk about degrowth as an objective, right? But to stop talking about growth as an objective. Once you liberate the public conversation from growth, then you have freedom to do other kinds of things that people will agree with. But I think the framing of degrowth in public politics, I think, would be a disaster right now. Maybe that will change in the next 10 years, I don't know. But right now, I think you would want to avoid it.
So yeah, thank you for your talk. It was very nice. I've got two questions, more or less. So you were talking about so deprivatization and shifting everything into the commons, which basically means that, well, yeah, we have to cancel like our current economy, or like basically cancel capitalism. But then like what this actually means is that like basically then the whole economy would be in the hand of the state, kind of. Or like how would you imagine that? And also the second question, kind of related. So like you were also talking about like make companies more independent of shareholder value, because like, yeah, shareholder value always creates this incentive for profit. But then like shareholders are like also like a source of investment in our economy. So basically, if you don't have this shareholder value system, then how do investments work, basically? Thank you.
I want to answer the investment question, but your first question was, sorry, remind me your first question, just briefly. It was about...
So it was like about...
The commons, yeah.
Commons
No. No, I mean, if you know my politics, I'm definitely not calling for like authoritarian state ownership of the economy. Not at all, right? In fact, look, what I proposed here doesn't impinge. This is not like Soviet style. This is not a Soviet style economy. Let me be clear that I think that the main alternative to capitalism in the 20th century was an absolute disaster in an enormous number of respects. Okay, what we need. Okay, and this is important because the Soviet Union, for example, okay, was also growthist, deeply obsessed with growth imperatives, to the point of even inventing fake GDP numbers just to seem that they were growing even faster than they were, right? Which is not so different from what the UK did recently when they decided to include drug trafficking and prostitution and sex work, right, in the GDP figures. So I mean, look, like the traditional lefts, right, the traditional socialist lefts does not offer us an alternative because they too are growthists. I think we have to draw principles from the left, but we can't imagine that 20th century alternatives are the way forward. Right? We need something fundamentally different. We have to imagine something new. Nobody has yet tried a post-growth economy, right? Am I right? So this is something we have to invent. Now, about the commons, yes. I mean, we can have things like collectively owned transportation and water and rail and hospitals and education and so on, right? Without a totalitarian state. I mean, this is not a crazy idea. And furthermore, I think that it should be not necessarily state-owned or controlled, but rather on a more kind of collective model, okay? With stakeholder and worker involvement. Community-owned also wherever possible. And this is also where the Labour Party is quite interesting. People say the Labour Party in the UK is a throwback to the 1970s. No. I mean, the ideas they're proposing are very new, right? They're talking about worker co-ops at a number of levels in the economy. That's a big change. That was not the 1970s, okay? So this is new. But also furthermore, the kinds of universal basic services I'm calling for is not incompatible with an otherwise market-oriented society. And a market-oriented society is not the same as capitalism, right? And this brings me to your second issue, the one about shareholder investments. So here's the thing: it's true that right now shareholders do determine the kind of investments that get made, and they make horrible decisions, right? They make horrible decisions that the humans behind them, even think are immoral, right? Do you know what I mean? But we do it because because it's an imperative of capital to get returns. So in a post-growth economy, the question becomes: if capital is not growing, how are you going to get investments in things you want? How are you going to get investments in renewable energy infrastructure, for example, right? Well, the answer to that is that you use the state to direct investments to where you want it to go, okay? This is not a crazy idea. It was used very effectively during the New Deal period, very effectively during the Reconstruction period in the wake of the war in Europe, okay? With the state deciding what to invest in, using national investment banks to guide capital, using prudential requirements, using mandatory bond purchases, right? I mean, this is not crazy stuff. In fact, the direction of investment right now is not working for things like renewable energy. We can't rely on the market to magically achieve the things that we want it to do. And this is where a democratic decision, okay, about where to move the capital we do have becomes so important. It just doesn't make sense to kind of grow the economy indiscriminately and hope that you get the outcomes you want. Why not just target those outcomes right away with public policy? So that's kind of what I'm calling for.
It started here. There's
just wanna make sure
all
we
of a
get
sudden a
rid of
lot. I wanted to say, ihr könnt eure Fragen auch gerne auf Deutsch stellen. Wir übersetzen die dann einfach. Es muss nicht alles auf Englisch sein. Aber jetzt haben sich sehr viele gemeldet. Die ersten zwei hier und dann müsst ihr mir nochmal helfen.
Well, I'll stick to English. As an American, more embarrassing than usual, seeing the graph that you had put up with the US in the top right of consumption. Yeah, pretty rough. So sort of piggybacking a little bit off the sentiment from the previous question, I guess I was just reading an article on the importance of small business with farming in the US. So they're getting decimated, probably having larger companies sort of taking the onus or shifting a little bit back towards small business. But my question is not related to that at all. It is, so the beginning of the beginning of the presentation is framed in a way that we have all the solutions available in terms of reshifts, sorts of policies we can impose on companies. And then you also frame the discussion in terms of the onus being on high wealth countries sort of getting their act together. What sort of mechanisms do you propose for cooperation among these high wealth countries, given that Paris really isn't going anywhere? Short?
Yes. Short. We all want all this. You too, short.
All right. So would you like me to slow down, sir? Would that be better? I apologize. So what mechanisms would you propose for high wealth countries to do some method of political cooperation in order to reasonably assemble minds and resources towards not just speaking about cooperation, but actually getting it past the point of the Paris Agreement that hasn't gone anywhere?
Yeah, okay. Should we take a couple questions at a time? Because I feel there's frustration in the room. Do you have the mic? There's someone over here who had a question.
Okay. So we take a bunch of questions.
Let's take 2 or 3 at a time.
Yeah.
Just to make sure we get enough voices.
Try to gender.
Wait, sorry, I want to make
now.
sure.
Okay.
We're
So you start, and then.
Okay, my question might sound a bit, or if it makes you uncomfortable, it might. I just wanted to note to the point that for me, how I understand post-growth, it's often also the discussion is deeply connected with the post-colonial discussion, and also what I've encountered your literature before. It always talks also about the whole how this high material consumption is possible in certain parts of the world is at the cost of other parts of the world. In today's presentation, that was not so present, so I was thinking if it's because catered to a specific audience. And additionally, I noticed like when you were talking about this advertisement ban on Sao Paulo, and then I think that there's in the end you use this word like if a country like a third world country can do it, why can we not? And for me it was like quite unnecessary to kind of steal that instigates this like the mainstream thinking that is already there. And for me it was like it was quite unnecessary where we're already pushing that it could be like a past colonizers or the colonizers and the colonial countries. So just, I wanted to point that out. And what's your thought on that? Was it? Yeah.
I'll just, okay, yeah. One more.
Hi. My question is directed to what happens to interest rates because they don't work in that way. And what happens then to the banks and to the stock market if there are no interest rates, because then we wouldn't have a stock market, right?
Okay, let's see if I can answer these questions. So the one on cooperation, yes, I think cooperation is essential. It used to be said like you can't have an island of socialism and a sea of capitalism, right? I think that something is similar, a little bit similar with growth. Like it's difficult to have a kind of island of post-growth and a sea of growth. And the reason everyone says is because if you get Germany right to become a post-growth economy, then capital is going to bail out of Germany and go to the Tory-controlled UK, where they'll get plenty of growth opportunities or something like that. I mean, I shouldn't jinx the elections. Actually, it's going to be labor-controlled, obviously. But the answer to that is this, right? We can use capital controls, and again, this is something that has kind of fallen off the table in public discussion, but were used extensively in the progressive period in the post-war. Okay, so and this doesn't mean that capital can't leave the country. you just make it more difficult. You say, look, you can take your capital overseas, but if you want to do that, you have to apply to the government, and there's a 5-year cooling off period or something like that, or 3 years, okay? So eventually it happens, but there's a disincentive for it. And so the capital stays in the country and gets invested locally or domestically. That's exactly the kind of approach we would need in the absence of regional cooperation. But obviously, regional cooperation is preferable, and this is one reason why we have to sort of significantly reform the EU, and we need to back DM25 to do that. To your questions, thank you so much for asking that. Yes, degrowth has a significant decolonization angle to it, which is important to me. I didn't bring that up because I thought I would be addressing primarily a global north kind of audience in terms of policy. Now, the reason that degrowth is decolonial is because 50% of the resources that global north countries consume, and we saw how much they consume, come from the global south. It's an extractive relationship that has extraordinarily destructive ecological entailments. Okay, I see this in my own home country of Swaziland, where a huge amount of the sugar that Britain consumes is extracted from Swaziland in ecologically destructive ways. So degrowth in rich countries is effectively a call for decolonization of poorer countries, a kind of release of that extractive relationship. About the Sao Paulo example. The reason I said that was simply because people will say, well, you need to have advertising in order to keep the economy growing. But the point is that if that's not true for lower income countries, there's absolutely no reason it can't be. It's also not true for richer countries like Germany. Okay, and this is why I raised that. I actually don't like the term third world. I use global south. I don't know why I said third world. So I do apologize for that. I think it is a problem actually. And there was another question about interest rates. So yes, this is an issue. Okay, so I should be clear. Someone said that at the beginning of the presentation, I made it seem as though all the solutions are already there. In fact, that's not the case. There are a number of areas that we still have to do research on, right? So how the financial system works is one of those. How the pension system works is another one. There's a PhD student who's right now working on what pensions will look like in a post-growth economy. Okay, that's important work. And so a lot of this new emerging research can be found online at Research and Degrowth, a website. And some new stuff is emerging on finance, on the financial sector there. But look, interest rates. Look, there's no reason that we have to have interest rates on all lending. Okay, we can have zero interest loans. We can have zero interest lending. This is regular in Islamic finance. Okay, and I don't see any reason why we can't make that a crucial part of our own economy. So, any other questions I can take?
Yeah, hier geht's. You start.
Yeah. Hello. I'm from Romania, and in Romania we're still, a low-income country, and I was just wondering, for these poorer countries that still don't have even the basic infrastructure and basic systems working, like a health system, for example. How would switching to this kind of economy in the West impact those countries which still rely on the consumption from the West, and how would you imagine their growth in such a system?
Yeah, so I want to be clear. I'm not calling for. Oh, we can take a few.
Yeah, I think we should again take 2 or 3 questions,
okay,
because there were so many hands raised.
I'll get to you.
All right. First of all, thank you for the presentation. I have a question with regards to the threat of fascism. I'm sure there's many people, or some people at least in the room, who on this coming weekend will take to the nearby coal areas to kind of practice degrowth and blocking coal infrastructure, and might potentially be faced with not so kindly minded people in the region, including right-wing people. But that's not the kind of threat that I'm talking about. I'd rather think about the threat more in terms of a long shot, because we see the hijacking of post-capitalist or anti-capitalist and post-growth ideas also by the right and by conservative forces, like with Extinction Rebellion, some fractions thinking about, should we reach out to Nigel Farage because he's changed his stand on climate change. But there's also within the AfD, the German right-wing party, talks about, yeah, we are reaching planetary boundaries and we might have to think about a world without growth or beyond growth. So how do we, moving further into the future, those who of us who are concerned with degrowth, how do we address that threat, and how do we address the fact that there's an increase in right-wing governments across the world that might hijack these ideas and then do it top-bottom, not the way we want it, which is bottom-up and society-driven?
Hi, I wanted to ask exactly the same question as the girl from the other side. I just want to complete that. I think we have the same concern, and in non-industrialized countries, no, because I know many countries that wouldn't have a washing machine if Germany goes degrowth, no, and they don't have the time with demographic explosive expansion to create such a local industry that would replace that. This is also decolonialization, no? They have everything, of course, in place to develop such an industry, but would it be the case that rich countries maybe have to also support in any ways this transition to a more local industrial landscape?
Really good questions, thanks. And I'm so glad that both of you raised this question. So I want to be clear first, I'm not calling for degrowth in low or middle income countries, okay? We can be very specific about where degrowth needs to happen. I mean, the science on that is quite clear. This is not a question of guessing, okay? But you raise an important question. If rich nations degrow, then what's going to happen to lower income nations that rely on exports to richer nations for their own income, for their own GDP? But the answer to that actually you hint at in your own question, which is import substitution industrialization. I mean, and again, this is important to realize. It might sound crazy to us right now that countries could substitute their imports with their own industrial production. But this is exactly what the main plan was across the global south in the immediate post-colonial decades of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, okay? It was a progressive period where the idea was, why are we importing matches and textiles from Britain when we can make those things ourselves? And why are we exporting our resources at such extraordinarily cheap rates to be used by rich countries with little compensation in return, right? It's madness. It's a colonial kind of economy. And it was reversed during the progressive era for 3 decades. That proved to be a threat to richer countries who required that extractive relationship with poorer countries in order to maintain their high rates of growth. So what I'm calling for here is degrowth in fact allows room for a reversion back to the progressive period, okay, in global south nations, right? There's no reason why, I mean really, if we're going to say that poor countries need to be extracted from, brutally extracted from, by the North, simply in order for them to improve indicators of social well-being and so on, then we have really shut down our minds. That's effectively a colonial argument saying, and it was used, repeatedly during the colonial period. This kind of extraction must be done for the good of the colonies. It's crazy. And so we have to be able to break out of that frame and recognize that, every ton of material that is not extracted from the global south is a ton of material that can be used there or not used, as the case may be, for the needs of the domestic economy, right? That's the kind of way we have to think about this. So.
But this transition, it would be.
You're wondering about the speed of the transition.
No, how rich countries can support this transition
Yes.
to the local industry as a way of indemnization for everything you have said now.
Yes, yeah. No, I mean, look, I absolutely agree. I think that something like climate reparations, could be used toward this end. This is something that I call for. I mean, reparations on all sorts of different levels, I think, could be leveraged for something like this to sort of speed a transition in global South countries. I mean, one problem does become like in a post-growth economy, right? Then does it become more difficult to get something like reparations debate happening? And I think that's a legitimate question. And this actually goes to your concerns, right? In a post-growth economy, do you get something like fascism rising, like a kind of nationalism? You know, if we have, if suddenly we're talking about limited growth, right? Then do we get a kind of fascist nationalism emerging? But here's my counter to that. Is to say that the real driver of fascism is actually austerity, the way I see it. Okay, I mean, the consequences of the financial crash and austerity that followed that have driven fascism rising in Europe. We see this in the UK very clearly, and here in Germany. And what's interesting is that people will say, okay, degrowth sounds like austerity. Degrowth is going to drive fascism in the same way that austerity has done. But in fact, exactly the opposite is true. Okay, austerity is an expression of a growth-oriented economy. Okay, that is willing to cut commons and cut wages and cut public goods for the sake of getting more growth. Okay, austerity is like a desperate expression of growthism. In a post-growth economy, we want exactly the opposite. We want to invest in public goods, invest in commons, invest in fair distribution of existing income, et cetera, so people will live better lives. Okay, will have access to the goods they need more easily than they presently do. And to me, that is a recipe for exactly the opposite of fascism. That's a recipe for solidarity, and for sharing. And I think that our politics will sort of break free from the constraints of austerity-imposed nationalism, austerity-driven nationalism in a post-growth scenario where effectively, while we might have less, GDP growth, we will have more abundance in everything else that we need, right? And so I think that's the antidote to what you're suggesting. But I can't predict it. I mean, it's difficult to say how it could play out. And there could be a right-wing version of degrowth. And we must do everything we can to fight against that possibility. Okay, we want a progressive, decolonial, commons-oriented version of degrowth. And that's what we have to fight for.
Okay. Hi. Well, I actually come from Peru, which is like a country that was like probably really below the line of carbon emissions. But then I was thinking that several countries similar to Peru, like I don't know, Brazil or maybe India somehow or China, are above of this line. And then what usually happens to these countries is when you apply some of the measurements you talk about to raise quality of life, they usually, this pressure that comes to the formal people makes some of them move to informality, because that's what happens when the state actually regulates more. That's what usually happens in these markets, and they are like huge, vast.
Sorry, what happens? Sorry, I missed what you said. What happens?
Usually they move to informality. I mean, if you raise wages, if you do this kind of thing, usually that's what happens to places like Brazil. I don't know, like they will probably, most enterprises will start to do business in an informal way and get separated from the state, because that's what's happened.
Okay,
yeah.
Sorry, yes, okay, yeah.
Hi, I have a question regarding why, I mean, you presented a very compelling narrative, but why don't we see anything in politics moving towards such ideas or towards such worlds? Why don't we have any parties who pick up on this? Can you give maybe some ideas why this is the case?
One more or two?
Yeah, one more.
I think we're both. Ich glaube, du. Aber ich bin aber fair, weil Sören hat sich zuerst gemeldet.
Du magst. So this is connected to the last question. So I would put it like, I think there's like, this is all great. Like everything you said is great. Like, and I want it. And I'm an organizer, so you know, like I'm a progressive organizer, so I'm organizing for it. But like, there's one thing missing from your whole talk and like your whole equation, which is power. So the question is like, this requires massive amounts of power for all of us, for like everyday people who want this. And as someone who's like trying to organize for that power, I must say, like, so like, I mean, this is like a very positive talk and everything, but I'm I'm desperate right now, you know, because like I think, fuck, like how the hell are we gonna get enough power to do this?
Okay, good questions. Yeah, thank you so much. Really good questions. The informal economy question doesn't worry me too much because, in fact, all countries that have significant informal economies are not countries that need degrowth, right? So there's maybe some issues there, but we can talk about that afterwards. Like China to me poses some interesting questions. But anyways, the question about politics is an interesting one, but it's actually not true that political parties are not picking up on this. Okay, who's that person? You? Okay, yes. So if you look at the UK, for example, the front bench of the Labour Party, which is the biggest political party in Europe, okay, has reached out to ecological economists across the country to bring together a kind of working group on post-growth economic principles, right? That would have been unthinkable even just a few years ago, and yet now is happening in the Labour Party. The Green Party under Caroline Lucas has been embracing post-growth principles literally as they get published, right? I mean, they're reading up on this in real time and bringing it into their policy platforms. Labour and the Green Party are presently writing a bill for rapid decarbonization in the UK that embodies key post-growth principles like the ones we've seen here, right? Whether that gets passed is a different question, but the thinking is there. As for other countries, I don't know to the same extent, but I do know that DiEM25 has put together a Green New Deal platform for Europe. Is Paolo here, by the way? Yes. Oh, hello. That is probably one of the most progressive that I've seen yet. That actually does also embody post-growth principles. And so, there's little hints around that this is happening. But this comes back to your question, right? Which is the question of power. And it's true. I've not laid out a coherent plan for organizing around this vision. Most of what I have to do is try to convince people that it's a reasonable thing that we should approach, that we should attempt. Okay. It seems like this audience doesn't need that much persuasion, but which I wish I would have known ahead of time. I could have addressed this question more directly. But it does raise questions about a kind of political agenda around this. Like, how do you make that happen? But the way it's happened in the UK has been primarily through conversations with politicians who are open to sort of new ideas about climate. I mean, really, like the climate breakdown crisis has been the door through which post-growth principles have become thinkable. They've been around for a long time, but it's only now in the past couple of years that the crisis has really generated an energy around this, right? Like it's abundantly clear that without this, we're going to continue failing year after year, okay? And so this has created space for new conversations. And we should take advantage of that space. Speak to your politicians. Get involved in policymaking with political parties, right? This is how change happens. Again, I don't recommend that any political party comes out as pro-degrowth, or even necessarily, I think post-growth is probably okay in terms of the framing. But what matters is the policy behind it, right? You don't need to say that you are a degrowth party to have a shorter working week, or to have legislation for extended product warranties, or bans on planned obsolescence, or an end to food waste. All of this can be accomplished without coming out and saying that you're a degrowth party, right? So that's the kind of thing we need to get into legislation. And you probably know better than I do how to accomplish that. But we can talk about it. Yeah. More questions?
Actually, I wanted to ask a similar question that was just asked by Sören, because we work together in the field of activism. So I think it was already answered.
Well, yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. One thing is, I'm always wondering, shouldn't we also rethink as lefties, right? Shouldn't we rethink our relationship, or kind of addictive relationship, to the whole concept of labor? Because we have this kind of promise that somehow maybe we have a Green New Deal, but people will always keep their jobs. And in the face of this climate crisis, I'm a bit wondering, do we need a frank discussion telling people, no, you won't keep your jobs? looking at a country like Germany, you said to get rid of, what did you say? Socially unnecessary industries. But what about the car sector here? Is it socially unnecessary? How do you explain this to the workers? And then we tell them, okay, we produce e-cars. But then e-cars are built on lithium, nickel mining, again, exploiting the global south. So how do we get rid of this kind of false promise that things stay the same? Because I guess they can't stay the same. This is one question, and then the other question is, what do you think of concepts, and this is like really a question because I have no clue about it, of kind of unconditional basic income, and make this somehow related to ecology or climate, etc. Thank you.
Ich hatte hier jemanden vergessen. I left someone out. I don't know who it was. Okay, I start here, and then we have one last session, and then we have a couple.
Yeah, you stated that the Green New Deal is kind of embodies some post-growth principles, but I was a bit confused with that because my reading of the Green New Deal or the Green Industrial Revolution is to spur economic growth through massive public investment, especially in electric cars, which will, is a whole idea of restarting the economy in the States and in the UK. And I think there are different interpretations of growth in these platforms. And I think it's not so easy just to say, oh, this is post-growth immediately. I don't think the people making the platforms agree with that per se. I mean,
yeah, I'm definitely not saying that. Sorry, is there another one?
There were. Aber du warst schon mal, oder? Okay, aber dann short, because it's not fair for us.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I think the main concern that occurs with this whole philosophy is that the economic throughput would just decrease, and then the question arises, like, where will we get the wealth to redistribute? If everybody's poor, then you can't really help each other.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad you raised that question because it's something I need to clarify. Okay, now what I'm not calling for is for a massive contraction of the economy. What I'm effectively calling for is a slow decline, right, in material throughput. Okay, and some of that will be offset by feasible rates of decoupling between GDP and material throughput, right? So, I'm not calling for impoverishment on any scale. Again, like if you look at what I was pointing to before, in the U.S., okay, in 1975, their economy was half the size in terms of GDP per capita, and yet their social indicators were better. There's less poverty in the U.S. with half as much income. Okay. So and Europe again, 40% less than the U.S. I mean, so in many ways, the kind of shift I'm calling for is geared towards an economy that requires a lot less GDP in order to deliver happy, healthy lives. Okay, and that's true also of public services. Look at the U.S. right now. They spend $9,000 US per person on healthcare every year. Okay? In the UK, they have a better healthcare system despite massive cuts, with better health outcomes, and it's 1/3 of the price, $3,000 per person per year for a better health system, right? So the inefficiencies in the private system are extraordinary. The waste is extraordinary, and so by shifting to a more publicly oriented economy for some of these basic social goods, actually requires less money than the existing system does. I think that's an important point to clinch. Your point about the G&D. I'm definitely not saying that existing Green New Deal policies are post-growth. What I'm trying to say is that these ideas are percolating within major political parties, well, at least in the UK. By major, I mean one. And the Green Party, right? It's true, the US Green New Deal is being sold as, it has traditionally been sold as this is a way to jumpstart the economy, okay? Now, the way that it's being formulated now under AOC, who works closely with Naomi Klein, who wrote a whole book about effectively post-growth, right, and climate change. If you look closely, they're avoiding the language of this is going to, drive economic growth. They're avoiding that language. They're taking the advice that the first step to a post-growth economy is to stop talking about growth as an objective. Start talking about what you actually want to achieve. What you want to achieve is good jobs, good wages, good social outcomes. Okay, happier, healthier people. That's the message you go for, and that's effectively what they're doing. You won't often hear them at least these key leaders of the Green New Deal in the US, talking about growth as an objective. It's true that the way that Corbyn has framed it is as an industrial revolution. The reason he's gone for that framing is because he believes that this is the best way to appeal to the labor heartlands in the industrial north, in the post-industrial north, right? You've been screwed by deindustrialization and by globalization. This is our chance to rebuild, industry. And look, let's not ignore the fact that during a rapid energy transition, there are going to be growth sectors, and we need some sectors to continue growing, right? Solar panels and wind turbines need to grow. Regenerative farming as an industry needs to grow, while other sectors decline. So this is not across the board decline. There will be big increases in jobs in certain sectors that completely aside from a shorter working week, et cetera, et cetera. This brings me to your question, which is a really important one, I think. I do think that a real problem with the left is its alliance with it has an alliance with capital. The unions do effectively. It has an alliance with capital because unions firmly believe that growth is in their interests. Because the more you grow, the more jobs there are, the more bargaining power you have, the more you can bargain wages up, right? But this is to me, this is a kind of false politics, okay? If you're relying on growth in order to secure your wage improvements, then that's a false politics because the majority of that growth is actually going to rich people. The vast majority of that growth is going to rich people and you are accepting a trickle down, right? And so in a post-growth economy, what we get is we get a real left politics where we're saying, and you're seeing this in Chile right now, aren't you? Growth is slowing down in Chile, and suddenly, what's the conversation about now? Inequality, right? Where was that conversation before? Nobody was having it because of growth. So in a post-growth scenario, you get real left politics where people are saying, okay, now we have to face up to what's really happening in the economy. And we are not okay with a huge proportion of existing income going to such a small number of people. So I think that's one key piece of it. But the other key piece, I think, is to get labor on board with the idea that workers will benefit from a shorter working week and fewer working hours, right? And that can be accomplished without losses to their quality of life. Ultimately, what people want is not necessarily just jobs. They want meaning, they want to feel like they're participating in society, and they want decent livelihoods, okay? If we can provide that while shortening working hours, then that's a win-win situation. The problem is, if you get rid of jobs without retraining people, you get rid of jobs without giving people meaningful alternatives to work in, or meaningful access to livelihoods, that's the problem. So we need to get labor on board with a shorter working week. I think that is absolutely essential. And I think that unions will be increasingly open to this. I mean, in my conversations with union leaders, that seems to be the case. But I don't know, let's see. Basic income. So this is interesting. I'm actually for basic income for a lot of reasons. But what's interesting is that in the post-growth economic models that we've done, basic income is less effective than universal basic services, okay? So, because basic income tends to create debt problems, and that makes post-growth policy a little bit more difficult to accomplish. Universal basic services seems to do the work in terms of giving people access to the goods they need to live well, okay, without the kind of spending requirements, okay, that UBI requires. Now, that's according to the models. Those models might have flaws that we could reconsider. And so I'm not going to take a firm position on this because I do believe that UBI can be an important component of this. But I think that we should not talk about UBI to the exclusion of universal basic services. That has to be part of the conversation.
So, last round.
Hello, Jason. Thank you very much. I liked some of the ideas that you teased out in your presentation. I work with a group of people that advocate for natural or resource-based economy. Have you heard about that?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts, because what we are basically, what we are advocating is that we need to go beyond the isms, right, the capitalism and socialisms, because they're all embedded in the monetary market system, which is inherently unsustainable. And so what you propose is that we legislate for those ideas, but legislation itself, I think it's not enough to impose sustainable behavior on unsustainable structure. And in addition to that, you can have change of government and then all the legislation is overturned. So
I wonder what is the extent of sustainability of these ideas and whether we should not just tear it all down and replace it with something much better.
I mean, is it okay if I just answer that question? Because there's a couple of things I want to say.
of course, you are the boss. You
Look, I agree with you. We should tear it all down and start over. But I don't think that's necessarily a feasible political pitch right now. Maybe that will be the case shortly. But I think that we have more success right now demonstrating empirically, right, that a post-growth economy is necessary and feasible and achievable and politically feasible, right? And so I think that's this is my pitch to you. I think this is the direction we should take in terms of our argument. In terms of our deep down politics, I mean, yes, I agree with you effectively. I do want to raise one question. I disagree that like legislation wouldn't be effective at accomplishing a significant reduction in material throughput. I think it would be, but there is an additional question we have to consider. As you cut, okay, so right, as we want this to be a socially just transition. Okay, so as we keep wages high, so you limit exploitation of labor, and as we limit exploitation of resources, which we should think of actually as the living planet, not as resources. All right, so if we limit exploitation in these two domains, then capital is stuck with a conundrum. It can't get surplus from labor. It can't get surplus from the living planet. Where is it going to get surplus from? Right, it's going to pile into speculation. It's going to pile into privatization. It's going to pile into debt. Effectively, what we've been seeing in the wake of the 2008 financial crash. All the horrible shit that's happened since then is going to happen even more if we start limiting exploitation of the living world. Okay, so how do you that becomes the question? How do you prevent that? You have to start thinking about how to euthanize the rentier dimensions of capital. Okay, and there's a big literature on that. The euthanasia of the rentier. I mean, that's what we need. And so let's not be naive, right? We need to be able to regulate against exploitation of humans and the rest of the living world while also preventing the inevitable shift in capital towards plundering other dimensions of the economy. Okay. Another thing I wanted to say while I'm thinking about it is this. Speaking of the living world, right? Here's another reason we need to scale down aggregate energy demands. And that is because if we continue to grow energy demands, and even if we did manage to succeed in rolling out enough renewable energy supply to meet it, renewable energy, contrary to popular belief, is in fact not clean. Okay? Even if it comes from the sun and from the winds, it requires an extraordinary material infrastructure to capture sun and winds. And the vast majority of those minerals and metals are going to come from the global south. There'll be an extraordinary increase in material extractivism for the sake of a renewable economy, right? If you try to power the global economy at 3 times the size that it is today, then you're going to see devastation across key global south regions that have these resources, okay? It's already happening in the Andes. It's already happening in the Congo, okay? Where some of these key rare earth minerals are found. If we want our transition to be socially just in addition to ecologically sane, right, then we need to reduce energy demand so that we do not have that kind of pressure on extractivism in the south, right? And we need to make sure those supply chains are just, right? So that a fair price is paid for those resources and they're extracted under fair labor conditions. If that's not part of our transition, then we have failed, right? So that's got to be a key feature for us. And I'll stop ranting. Was there another question?
Two last
questions.
Yeah,
yes.
short.
Yeah.
Keep it short and simple.
I'll try to be quick. So 40 years ago, the United States and the United Kingdom ushered in neoliberalism, and now we're still, despite everything that's changed, we're still looking to the UK and the US and kind of hoping that Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn can, I mean, I live in Germany, but I still look and pay more attention to what's happening there than here. Like, why do you think rich but maybe weaker nations are not able to usher in the kind of change? Why do we still look to the United States and the United Kingdom, and what can we do to change that?
That's interesting. Yeah, okay, good. One more.
My question is particular in the short. I'm focusing more on automation because the world is going without, we like it or not, it's going on technological ways. I mean, it's automated. Everything is become automated. So when everything is become automated, people lose job. That means directly affecting their happiness, which you talk about. Workers has to be paid per hour, right? But that will not happen if the world continue to grow in automation. So my question is that how do you tackle this, the automation of the world?
Okay, good. Yeah, so I really like your question. It's interesting to me. First of all, it's only partly true, right? Like some of the most interesting movements in Europe, like post-growth movements in Europe, are happening outside of the UK, right? Like across Southern Europe right now. I mean, post-growth and degrowth imaginaries are flourishing. I mean, look at Barcelona, for example. And this goes actually to the organizing question. If you want examples of where like people are organizing around degrowth, Barcelona is an amazing place to see. They're bringing post-growth and degrowth principles to the level of city administration. Okay, so this is possible, and this is from a grassroots movement, right? So in other areas of Europe that have been affected really brutally by austerity, we're seeing people, by necessity, invent new ways of organizing the economy. Okay, in the wake of austerity. But as far as some of the big state-level policy changes, you're looking to the UK maybe. It's an exciting time right now, but also this is the way I think about it, right? There was an amazing sign that I saw that was wielded by a protester in Chile, and it said, neoliberalism was born in Chile and has to die in Chile, right? And I think that's, there's something to that. There's some karma there, right? And I think the same is true of the UK, and I really feel drawn to the UK for this reason. It's not, I mean, I'm now a citizen, but it's not really my home. But industrialization happens in the UK with extraordinarily destructive effects in the global south, and that is where that sin, has to be reversed. That is where, this is where the reparations have to happen there. So we want to fight for a transition there, but this should not be. I mean, I don't know what the political situation is like in Germany as much, but I really would urge you to not let the UK, get away with this conversation without your participation. To the question of automation, yes, I mean, obviously this is going to be an increasingly big problem, but the answer is relatively simple. The only reason automation is bad, right, is because people lose jobs. Unemployment is bad, but there's no reason why we can't embrace automation and shorten the working week and make sure people retain high employment. How? By effectively taxing robots. Or, I mean, the better way to put that is just company profits have to go back to people. They have to go back to people. And in an automated economy, it gives companies the ability to extract profits from robots effectively without any return to people. And that obviously we can't allow to happen. And this is where something like a universal basic income could become quite important. Okay, or just collective ownership of companies, collective ownership of machines. In the sense of returns from productivity that machines generate should go back to workers, and this has been a claim by labor movements for a very long time. So I don't think we have to worry about that. I will say that I think that in a post-growth economy, I think probably we will have to think about cutting taxes on labor and increasing taxes on materials. Okay, and what that would mean is that would incentivize employment over automation. And I think that's okay. I think that, I mean, despite what I've illustrated here for you about the importance of a shorter working week, et cetera, I think that human labor is still an important feature in a slower economy, and we also should not be afraid of that. Okay, but the idea of automating, horrible jobs, we should not shy away from that possibility. Right? In fact, if anything. We've left a lot of automation potential off the table because labor in the global south is so extraordinarily cheap. And what I want to see is significant wage increases in the south as part of a global post-growth kind of economy, which I think would drive more automation in certain global south industries. That's not a very inspiring note to end on, but but yeah, right? Amandla.